Step 4 is probably the trickiest step. It's not difficult, but you have to make sure that you fold your pants right so you end up with 2 pant legs and not 2 fronts to 2 backs. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Step 4 tells us to pin front to back at side seams, so 1 front to 1 back, and now we're sewing the seam that runs from our hip bone down to our outside ankle bone. Stitch side seams, leaving an opening between large circles. So in the picture, they show you where to start and stop sewing. You're gonna have no stitching in between the 2 circles. The stitching that you see here already is when you sewed your pocket on at 3/8 of an inch. Since our directions here didn't tell us what seam allowance to use, we're gonna default to that beginning sewing direction step of sewing at 5/8. Let me show you how to fold your pants and we'll go over sewing the side seam. This is how they were sewn below in a previous step where we sewed the U and we sewed our front to our front and our back to our back. If we sew down the side seams here, we're gonna be sewing our front to our front and our back to a back. But think about what the directions told us and think about how your pants are made. So let's look at our ready to wear pants again. The seam that we sewed before was a front to a front and a back to a back. But now, if we're looking at these pants, we're sewing the side seam here. So we want to sew a front piece to a back piece. So we need to fold our pants so that they actually start to look like pants and not this weird curved one-legged thing. So the easiest way to do that is going to be to pull apart our inseams. So laying my pants out like this, I'm going to put one hand underneath and grab the seam, and I'm going to put one hand on top and grab the seam. So I'm just grabbing the 2 seams that we've sewn previously, and I'm going to pull it apart. Now, when I pull it apart, you're going to be like, well, this didn't make anything, but keep moving your hands down your inside seams, and then lay out your pants, because now they actually start to look like pants. So here we have 2 legs and we have a front to a back and a front to a back. How can I tell? Because look, they're 2 different sizes. And remember that your back piece is always going to be bigger. The back of your body is bigger than your front. So that's how I can tell that I don't have 2 fronts and 2 backs matched up. All right? So I'll show you that one more time if you need it. But in a previous step, when we sewed the U, our center crotch seam, it looked like this. Okay? We don't want to sew this together because where are your legs going? So you got to do some critical thinking about this, all right? These don't look like pants. When I lay out pants, even ready to wear pants, it's not what they look like, all right? So we need to take our inseam. So I have 1 inseam here and 1 inseam on the back. I'm going to grab them about 6 inches down, pull them apart, and flip them, moving my hands down the inseam, shaking them out a little bit until I have something that resembles, or at least more closely resembles, pants with pockets sticking out right now. Okay? So our next step then is to sew this side seam. Again, your fabric pieces don't want to match up. You have a back and you have a front, which are cut from 2 different tissue paper pieces. If they were supposed to match up, they wouldn't have given you 2 different pieces. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and start lining up your outside seam. This is going to run down the outside of your leg. Not paying attention to anything else. It's okay that this is wrinkly in here. It's okay that this doesn't match up. What you want to match up is your cut edges. So all you're paying attention to is lining up. I'm starting from the bottom, but you can start from the top. It doesn't really matter. And put a pin in to hold it lined up. Okay? Move down your leg, the outside of your leg. Put a pin in. Make sure it's lined up. And you're going to repeat this, pinning all the way up this side and all the way up this side. A left leg and a right leg. I wanted to take a minute to note pinning the upper pockets. So one of the things you need to be careful of when you are getting, when you're pinning the side seam up near the pockets is that your pockets match up. And what I mean by that is when you open up from the inside, are your seams laying on top of each other? So this is kind of like when we did the U seam or when we did our box corners in our drawstring bag. But if the pocket pieces are off, meaning your seams aren't matched up, when you go to sew the pocket or in the next step, you're going to be able to see the pocket from the outside of your garment. And you don't want to. It's eventually going to be on the inside. You don't see a pocket usually on the outside. So just in order to line that up, all I do is very similar to the U. I kind of like lay it on top of each other, just making sure that my seams are right on top of each other. And then I poke a pin through. See if you poke it through on this side, does it match up on the other side? In this case, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be really close. Another tip for this is remember that second step of our direction, or I guess not step, but the second kind of piece of the direction was to not sew in between our markings. So what I like to do sometimes when I am sewing, I have all different colored pins here, but you should have mostly yellow. Maybe you have a couple different colors. Is sometimes I will put a different colored pin at my marking to remind me to stop sewing there. So when you stitch this, remember those X's we transferred with our tracing paper and our tracing wheel? We are not going to be sewing between those X's. So here is one and here is the other one. There will be no stitching between here and here. If you sew all the way up, you're gonna sew your pocket closed and you can't get your hand in. So we're gonna leave an opening to get into our pocket. We're going to start stitching from the top or from the bottom, it doesn't matter. And you're gonna do your back stitch and then stop stitching when you get to the dot and then back stitch and then start again at the other dot, okay? It doesn't matter if you start from the bottom or if you start from the top. Either way, you're never gonna have stitching in between those two dots that you transferred from the tissue paper. Using my stretch stitch, I'm going to stitch my outside seams. Keep in mind the directions. They didn't tell us a seam allowance, so we're going to be sewing at 5/8, and it told us to stop and don't sew between our markings. So I'm starting for this leg, I'm starting at the top, and this proves to be a little bit difficult because look, you can't see where 5/8 is because your pocket is covering that up. But remember that you sewed your last seam at 3/8. So essentially you should be about 2/8 or a quarter of an inch away from your last seam. So not quite even with the edge of the presser foot because that would be 3/8, but just about like putting your previous seam, as long as it's an even 3/8, maybe right on the inside of the presser foot. So you do kind of have to eyeball this part to make sure you can't tell where your edge of your fabric is if it's lined up at 5/8, but you do want a nice even line. So all I'm doing is stitching this little top part. I'm gonna stop when I get to my marking. So got to my marking, I'm gonna back stitch, which I'm on the stretch stitch, so it just does 3 times in a row. Cut it, move my fabric down until I get to my other red X, because I used red tracing paper. And now I'm going to stitch from this red X all the way down my leg. So just like with any seam, we are going to seam finish this. What I would recommend before you seam finish it is to try them on. Do they look like pants? Do your legs go in there? If you accidentally sewed your front to your front and your back to your back, you can take out the seam. But once you put in the seam finish, it's really gonna take you probably forever to seam rip both the seam and the seam finish. So that's why I would say try them on first before you actually go on to the seam finishing step. As with any seam, we're gonna seam finish this. So we are going to, I'm gonna switch to stitch 13, whatever seam finish you pick is fine. Remember, you're staying in the seam allowance, so outside of that seam, don't cross over that seam. And then when you get up towards the pocket, you don't need to seam finish up here. So you can stop when you get to the bottom of the pocket. You don't need to seam finish this part over the pocket because we're gonna end up sewing it, and then this part on top is gonna be end up like sewn to our waistband. So don't worry about seam finishing that. We're just gonna seam finish basically from the bottom to the pocket, or depending on which way you're sewing it, from the pocket down.